In the history of comic books, few stories require as little introduction as The Dark Knight Returns, a tale so ubiquitous its influence is difficult to escape. Published in 1986 alongside Watchmen and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Maus, The Dark Knight Returns plots the end of Batman's career as a crime fighter. Taking place in a version of Reagan's America at the height of Cold War tensions, the world of The Dark Knight Returns is one in which superheroes have been outlawed, and Superman has become little more than a puppet of the American government and a nuclear deterrent for Soviet Russia. In addition to launching the modern era of comic books, The Dark Knight Returns is still directly referenced and emulated to this day. Popular examples of this appropriation include the Christopher Nolan Batman films, which borrow large story details, motifs, dialogue, and design work directly from The Dark Knight Returns. Bruce Wayne's childhood trauma of falling into the Batcave is recreated in the first scene of Batman Begins. Nolan's Batmobile also bears striking resemblance to the monstrous The Dark Knight Returns version. Batman's fight with Bane in The Dark Knight Rises is also at least a thematic partner of Batman's duel with the leader of the mutants in The Dark Knight Returns, Nolan even going so far as to rework old dialogue.
You fight like a younger man. There's nothing held back.
Of course, a more recent example is the much maligned High Court case, Batman v Superman, a movie so obsessed with The Dark Knight Returns that it attempts to recreate the saga's final confrontation entirely within its trailer. Directly lifting costume designs for Batman, both robotic and casual, as well as more obscure references such as this line of dialogue.
It is a three-syllable word for any thought too big for little minds.
Originally uttered by Lana Lang 30 years earlier. By extension, the darker tone of the story can also be credited for helping create the current obsession with dark and grittiness as a cinematic practice, an unfortunate side effect of excellent ideas being taken well past their logical application. In animation, The Dark Knight Returns has been faithfully recreated as a two-part DC animated film, and most impressively appears in the Batman the Animated Series episode, Legends of the Night. Within the comic book universe itself, the impact was even more staggering and immediate. The politically partisan nature of the story and the tensions of the Cold War era ushered in a new age for the medium of psychological complexity and moral ambiguity. The book even predicted the demise of Jason Todd at the hands of the Joker 2 years before this became canon by a macabre phone poll of DC readers. The story begins with a despondent Bruce Wayne searching for a worthy death. Having retired the cape and cowl 10 years earlier, Gotham continues to be assaulted by the criminal classes, and particularly a gang calling themselves the Mutants. A rehabilitated Harvey Dent and a catatonic Joker are also reawoken by Batman's return, as is the debate around the value of vigilantism, which is played out in discussions between expert panelists throughout the story. Featuring a female Robin and a society on the verge of self-destruction, The Dark Knight Returns asks the question, do true heroes ever die? However, describing the story in such grandiose terms loses something in the telling. The spectre of such a lauded Batman story often tends to whitewash people's memory of what The Dark Knight Returns really was. While Batman's redemption is certainly at the forefront of the story, Miller takes a broader focus upon social unrest and contemporary malaise through vignetted pages focusing upon the lives of ordinary Gothamites. One such page centers on the character of Margaret Corcoran, a single mother on the verge of financial ruin, returning home with a paint set for her son, purchased with rare tip money, her story ending with a fatal encounter with the mutant gang. But Miller does not waste a panel on the grenade's explosion, instead leaving that to the reader's imagination, and choosing to punctuate the story with a blasé description of the nightly news. Woman explodes in subway station, film at 11. Drawn in Miller's characteristically messy style, with inks from Klaus Janson and colours from Lynn Varley, The Dark Knight Returns characters are often depicted as ugly or physically deformed, as though to give an outward appearance to the psychological turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. An obese Lana Lang is seen arguing Batman's case on the news, while a similarly sized Selina Kyle now runs a brothel. Batman himself has become a hulking mass of a man, described by Carrie Kelly as 12 feet tall. Many of the story's splash panels depict Batman as frequently monstrous and inhuman, to match the feral nature of the Force possessing Bruce Wayne. However, splash panels are used reservedly in the first chapter of The Dark Knight Returns in favor of dividing pages into a seemingly dangerous number of panels. For comparison's sake, the aforementioned Watchmen would commonly contain pages divided into 9 panels, while The Dark Knight Returns commonly splits pages 16 different times, as is the case on the very first page. The vast number of panels often means very small intervals of time separate each image, a technique identified by comic veteran Scott McCloud as moment-to-moment transitioning. By contrast, the typical American comic book relies upon action-to-action transitioning, a style which leaves more time between each image and usually focuses upon violent or outlandish motion, which could not easily be captured by individual frames. The result is an introspective opening chapter which concerns itself more with the mental welfare of Bruce than his physical skills, the story instinctively avoiding a fight scene early on as a nod to this quieter tone. The moment-to-moment style of The Dark Knight Returns involves very little closure on behalf of the reader, closure being the human ability to extend our perception of reality beyond mere observation. A similar concept to the gaps and silences found in literature, closure appears between every single panel in a comic book as the medium necessitates, by virtue of not being animation, that something has been left out. To this end, pages are packed with panels, emulating the schlocky American news cycle of the day, the lack of closure being the perfect device to critique a phenomenon designed to influence and control viewers' thoughts. This effect, combined with the generally sparse amount of negative space between panels, leaves the reader with very little room to breathe or think freely. The division of the story into these minute units of time and space is realized in-universe with the aid of Wayne Manor's panel glass atrium, emulating the panels of the comic book and literally fragmenting Bruce Wayne's view of the world. Its destruction on the following page signs both a turning point in the story and a change in the storytelling. While news reports and plot-heavy scenes featuring Commissioner Gordon or other minor characters still see an emphasis on extreme subdivision, Batman's appearances take place in large splash panels, free from the ultra-focused moment-to-moment storytelling, a deliberate choice which provides the reader room to stretch their imagination. The battle between the tightly controlled news broadcasts and the forces of the reader's imagination mirror the struggle between governmental tyranny and the disorganized freedom offered by superheroics. The relentless stream of opinions, arguments, and their respective recriminations from talk show hosts and eyewitness interviews, rendered with fastidious line work and a lack of motion, stand in direct contrast to the bombastic action sequences which appear ready to leap from the page in an orgy of curvature and freeform shape. Action scenes invite the participation of the reader, explosions and punches not rendered moment to moment, but rather action to action, allowing the full impact and force to be determined by the final collaborator. The return of superheroes and their villains also sees the return of disparity in the form of color seeping back into the monochromatic world of the everyday citizen, the book becoming gradually more colorful with each passing chapter, as though civil unrest were creating a vacuum in which only color could fill. Mutants in particular are depicted as entirely silhouetted or gaudy and varied in their color palette. The book's use of color is never as simple as assigning good and evil. Instead, color pervades this book, sometimes like a sickness. Superman's first appearance marking the brightest page in the entire book, in effect later leveraged to vilify him as an unnatural drain on a world where color is a natural commodity. Batman himself is identifiable through his iconic shades of blue and yellow, while Carrie Kelly's classic version of the Robin colors serves to prevent Batman from completely succumbing to the darkness which surrounds him. And what shall we say of the story's famous conclusion? A Superman acting to preserve the government's control over the population, and a Batman willing to die in defiance. Held up by some as proof of Batman's superiority, it is worth remembering that neither man has the will to kill the other. Perhaps what works so well about this ending is the consistency of character. Superman, though the ultimate representation of institutionalized power, remains nonetheless Superman, pictured here chastising Carrie Kelly for fighting him on a school night. Batman himself nearly crosses his moral line at several points in the story, first considering it when confronted by the leader of the mutants. But even with the tools to utterly destroy Superman, he relents, engineering an escape through his timeless wit and some clever chemistry. Batman deliberately chooses not to kill his old friend, and a knowing Superman leaves Batman to continue his crusade underground. A curiously optimistic ending in some ways, and an inevitable one in others. The conclusion of The Dark Knight Returns is an excellent place to leave off, and never again return to these characters. Until that is, the sequel was released.